Our first individual on the stage is a partner and global head of human capital at Apollo. Brett Felder serves as chair of the advisory board on AI analytics and the future of work at Georgetown University and the board of advisors at Georgetown McDonough School of Business. My friends, please help me welcome to the stage Matt Brightfelder. Sorry. Our next guest is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School. She is considered one of the top researchers and definitely the top publisher on this area of psychological safety. You know her. Let's welcome to the stage Dr. Amy Edmondson. Our next guest is Director of Learning and Development and a Coherence Architect here at NLI. She's got an academic background in linguistics and psychology at Columbia University, and she leads for us initiatives that help organizations to leverage the science of psychological safety. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Camille Inge. Our next guest is CEO of the EXCO Group. The EXCO Group is a global firm of experienced CEOs, independent directors, and global business leaders who specialize in an organization's most valuable asset, and that is leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Reimer. And last but not least, the reason why we're here, he is co-founder of the NeuroLeadership Institute and its CEO. Let's welcome our host for the first session today and our host for this conference, Dr. David Rock.
Good morning, good morning. It's great to be back in person, isn't it? This is our first summit in person, and we heard a whole bunch of people in the last few days said, you know what, this is hybrid, I'm going to stay home. We actually have a much bigger audience online, so welcome to everyone online. We have the option. I hope you don't choose that tomorrow, just come back. It's great to be in person, isn't it? But it's our first hybrid event ever. We're really excited about all the things that we'll learn as we do that. So this is an important session. This is a session with a lot more questions than answers, first of all. Let me just say that up front. We wanted to kick off the summit with some big ideas, with some provocations, with some things to kind of reflect on over the 2 days. And we've got some phenomenal thinkers, really big thinkers up here joining us for this experience. So I wanted to kick off with just kind of a couple of thoughts. You know, you look out into the world and you can see, wow, it's really, really important that we collaborate, right? There's some really big challenges out there. We need to collaborate. We need to collaborate in our towns and cities, in our countries, on the planet. But there's forces kind of going the other way, right? It's interesting. It's such a fascinating time. And particularly in organizations, leaders and employees aren't necessarily seeing eye to eye. And in fact, the tension between those two has probably never been greater. It seems like every day there's another strike going on somewhere, right? There's a really interesting tension out there. And, you know, it's been increasing. And is it just the political environment? Probably not just that. Is it the financial environment? Probably not just that. It's a lot of different things, but there's definitely some tension between employees and employees. And, you know, there's sort of a question, are we at a breaking point? 51 million people in North America quit their job last year. It's a lot of people. That was a record, and the previous year was a record of 47 million. So it's, you know, clearly getting bigger and bigger. So there's huge tensions between employer and employee, between leadership and you know, the people doing the work. And we're thinking about this as sort of irreconcilable differences, but with a question mark. Right. Are they irreconcilable differences, or is it just like a married couple who needs some help? Right? Maybe they just need some time with a therapist and kind of work out and a bit of validating and some other things, right? So we wanted to explore this question, kind of what are our irreconcilable differences? Are they really irreconcilable? You know, dig a little bit into that, and then how can we actually kind of all get along better? So we're going to have a conversation about this. As John said, there'll be a discussion here, give you a chance to talk to each other, get to know each other, digest and apply and discuss. So I'm going to hand to David Reimer to kick off with the first of these ideas, and we'll see if this is working.
I was going to say,
There we go. This one's
There we go.
one that's supposed to be working. It's working.
All right, thanks, great. Thanks, David. Some quick step back context for this. In the Journal of People and Strategy, we tend to, on a quarterly basis, organize discussions amongst senior leaders in writing and thinking and research around problem sets that we see in common across sectors. One of the things that started to become clear to us over the last 4 quarters probably is this notion of the differences where boards' assumptions and CEOs' assumptions and entry-level employees' assumptions and everybody in between actually were coming to the table with fundamentally different points of view about what good looked like. And I think we'll get to some research on that in a moment, but as we started unpacking it, we literally got to the point that we have to have the irreconcilable differences conversation and see where we go. And there's an issue that literally dropped yesterday where Diane Bryant, former CEO or CHRO of IBM, guided the discussion, and it starts to unpack some of this. So if I step back from that and think about the fact that this audience is comprised of leaders in your organizations, and all of us on this stage and in our daily life are also trying to both help the leaders of today be more successful and help build a pipeline for the leaders of tomorrow, there are some patterns out there that make that job harder, our job and their jobs, right? Number one, the notion that stakeholder capitalism, whether you believed in it in 2018 or not, like it's just life now. Everybody has an opinion, everybody has a voice, everybody has an X channel, not a Twitter channel, but there's direct access everywhere. All of the leaders' problem sets, by and large, are not yes or no. They're not binary. They're and problems. There's the challenges of your job. If you're in the same job today that you had in January of 2020, that job's harder today than it was. If you've just taken over the job, it's harder than it was for your predecessor. Like there's a level of complexity that gets layered onto the fundamental expectations of everybody's roles. And against that, John mentioned in his opening comments the notion that the human brain craves certainty and is looking to predict. There's a challenge for leaders, which is that our models for what good leadership look like are pretty much 20th century models. Our data sets, our competency sets, our metrics and rubrics for deciding in a corporate setting are all backward looking at a time when actually the future looks very, very different. So think about that just as the broader set. It raises a set of fundamental leadership tensions, and while it may be obvious that lead from front and lead from behind are competing challenges, the reality is there's interactions up and down these tensions where they cross over into one another. I think we did some original research with SHRM's executive network, where we have access to polling on a quarterly basis, executives, HR leaders, and American households. And a couple of things that show up that illustrate how this shows up, right? What organizations are looking for in their leadership development and leadership assessment right now, you can see here on the left, whereas on the right, you look at what employees want from leaders. And it's interesting to me that accountability is number one. They are not looking for just a fun place to come every day. They are looking for some level of accountability, but they're looking for different qualities than the organization is looking for and developing. Take that over to, okay, how about if we get it outside of leadership expectations and talk about how we work? Here's what employees want. But having said that, if you ask them what they're ready for, their level of readiness doesn't match their level of desire for change. We'll look at this from one more angle, which is that if you ask executives, what ESG factors do you think matter the most to your employees? They vector pretty heavily on the social front, possibly because as a leader, you can blow yourself up in your entire career very quickly on that, so it's their antenna are way up. But for employees, far and away, their number one priority is what's our environmental impact? So the point here, you could keep going on these kinds of data points. The point is, if you look at fresh data on what expectations people are bringing to the table, they're often, the expectations are different. And so I think for this discussion, David, as I get ready to hand this back, is what is it that we can do to help make those disconnects more connected, and resolvable.
Thanks very much, David. Yeah, grab a seat. Let's have a conversation with the panel, then you can talk to a friend for a few minutes. Maybe starting with Matt, from your perspective, are these differences irreconcilable, or what are you seeing? Your organization looks after many, many companies.
Yeah.
What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier the marriage therapy point, and since I'm the son of a therapist, I think my mother would be proud of me if I leaned into her wheelhouse. Look, the way that I look at this is I think we were sub-optimizing this contract before COVID. So as an HR professional, and as a former economist, I lie awake at night thinking about the fact that when you look at employee engagement, which is self-reported, we've historically had an 80% failure rate because only 20% of people rate themselves as highly engaged. As both a HR professional and as an economist, that's actually really bad. And I think about that, and if 70% of the intangible value of public companies is basically about talent and culture, that's all pre-COVID. That means that we had a huge disconnect before of a lack of human potential being realized in companies, and companies missing out on all that potential. And that's true in the greatest companies on earth. So something needed to change before. And when COVID started, I was literally at Georgetown teaching a course on the future of work, talking about that topic the day that we shut the world down. So I was going back and forth between the war room and my company and trying to figure out where the world was going. Good news, bad news. The good news, the strange gift of COVID, as scary and tragic a period as it has been and touched so many of our lives, the strange gift was that it helped us accelerate the humanization and the modernization of the workforce.
Yeah.
So we all got to experiment at scale, the biggest live experiment of change I think we've ever seen in the corporate world. And we learned a lot from that. The bad news is the disconnect kind of increased. So maybe because I worked at MasterCard, I think of this as a Venn diagram, just like the MasterCard logo. Let's come back to first principles. What are we really talking about? We're talking about human beings wanting to be in companies where they feel they can do the best work of their lives and where they can outperform and strive to be great at something, and companies with distinct strategies, distinct cultures, and distinct trade-offs. So let's go back to first principles. I'm really optimistic about that. But right now, it's too often a muddle and a disconnect. Companies need to be open-minded. We need to treat our companies like laboratories where we test things because we're chasing high performance as a company. Most companies revert to the mean. We're fighting against that. And as individuals, it can't be choose your own adventure. As an employee of a company, you're in service to what that company is striving to do in the world. But the companies need to listen to the individuals and say, hey, here's what I need to do the best work of my life. And if we meet in the middle, we can optimize both things. If we stay in an extreme stance and the company's got their head in the sand, or people are stuck in choose your own adventure, then we can't get much good done. But I'm very optimistic. If we meet each other in the middle, we can optimize both factors.
So we need to talk more. It sounds like
Common ground.
Talk more and understand each other. You know, I think of organizations as these massive experiments, messy experiments with no one even having a clear hypothesis, but experiments in improving human performance, right? So how they set goals, how they motivate people, how they manage people. But there's no kind of shared data between all these experiments. But they really are massive experiments totaling millions and millions of people in how do you best get the best out of humans and treat them respectfully. It's a great experiment. We're going to hear from Camille. We'll hear from you in the whole next chapter, but maybe Amy, some of your high-level thoughts on this question. Are our differences irreconcilable? Where are we?
Yeah, I'm just loving this conversation so far because the metaphors, treat the companies as laboratories. That's what I've been writing about. That's what I'm thinking about all day long. And by the way, that takes psychological safety to do it well. But it is such a different frame. So, my answer is no, I don't think they're irreconcilable, but I think they could be if we don't switch our mindset soon. Right? And the mindset has to be one of, I like to say, maybe because I'm married to a scientist, but think like a scientist. Of course, I'm a scientist too, but he's a real scientist. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, biology, all that good stuff. So What I think is we need to shift our mindset from the need to know and be right and be in control and save face to one of mutual learning. And it's hard, but it's not that hard. But it's just a flip of a switch. And when we flip that switch, we're in a very different space. It's a space that really can treat the company as a laboratory, which, by the way, is what it needs to be going forward. It just must be. So to shift from the kind of either-or thinking to the and thinking, as David put it, that we need to drive ourselves forward to figure out how this is going to work. And we're not going to just arrive somewhere where it works. This is going to be iteration all the way forward.
I hear my favorite mantra: follow the science, experiment, follow the data.
You bet.
What a crazy idea. Follow the science, experiment, follow the data around how we do these grand experiments. David, any closing thoughts there?
Yeah, just a quick comment on that starts to bring those 3 points together. We work with one of the largest insurers in the world, and they've been doing a study over about the last year and a half looking at where they have top performance across the organization, and they're very different parts of the business. The one data point that came back in common across all of them is that the parts of the organization run by managers who ask for feedback on a regular basis.
So that's the best one. Beautiful. Let's give you an opportunity to digest. One of the things that we do at the summit, we realize that it's really nice to think about ideas in chapters and have a little pause. And we have what we call a digestion break every 15 minutes or so. So this is a chance just for literally 3 minutes. We're going to keep it pretty short, but for literally 3 minutes, we'll wave and shout when it's time to come back. Just talk to the person next to you about your thoughts on what you've heard so far, and then we'll go to Camille to dig in further. Take 3 minutes. Go for it. Welcome back.
We need to be there.
So we'll have an opportunity to do that in most sessions. It's a good chance just to process the ideas and information, and really good practice when you're presenting ideas of any sort to have people have an opportunity to process and digest. So let's hear from Camille.
Okay,
next
and
up.
can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
So why aren't we getting along? Let's zoom out and take a look at the relationship that we're trying to fix. Are there any foundational differences or differentiators between employee and employer that might shed some insight into why it's hard to reconcile these differences? So let's take a look. 2 words, employee, employer. What is the central difference? What do you notice? I'm asking you. Did someone say a noun suffix at the end? It's rather simple and small, but it is a EE versus an ER.
One letter.
So an EE at the end denotes that someone is the patient or recipient of something, in this case, employment, a job, a very valuable resource. And the other is the agent or the giver of something. You give this person a job or taketh away. So it's a differentiator of control. In other words, of power. So power is defined as the asymmetric control over valued resources, job, money, decision-making power. And it's about who gets to make decisions when 2 people care about something, but only one person has the control to make the decision, the other person has to live with it. And it turns out that power, being in a position of power, actually has pretty reliable cognitive and motivational effects. Power changes your brain. It literally alters your perspective. It does so in many ways. We'll focus on one that I find most relevant to this relationship issue. But it's shown to reorient one's focus of attention. And so we're now kind of hyper-focused on goals. What's our strategy? What are we aiming for here? And in turn, less so on people. It can also shift our prediction of outcomes. So we're actually become a bit more optimistic about how things will work out. and are less concerned with possible risks, less risk sensitive. And it alters our level of thinking. So we're not so concerned with the details, we're focused on the big vision. We have to be. We're in a position of power and leadership. We have to see where we're going. So most relevant for this relationship talk, I would say, is the people part. So studies have shown that when participants are in a position of power and they have to make a decision regarding people, their approach towards people is driven by whether or not they see people as useful to meeting their own goals. So in other words, people get construed as tools. I have an issue with that. Tools don't have nervous systems. They don't have thoughts or feelings or opinions, needs, families of their own. And I wonder about, what do you do with a tool when it's not what you need? You toss it back in a messy closet. So I personally wonder about how people decisions are made, about how people are affected in a relationship where they're essentially seen as a hammer. So I'd like to take a moment to align on the people perspective. Just at the core, what is it that people need from one another? Many of you are familiar with this, some not. So let's start at the top. It's about just understanding the core drivers of human behavior. What are we all concerned about at any moment in time? So we all do have a common goal, which is stay alive, reproduce ideally. But generally in every waking moment, the underlying organizing principle is to avoid threats and danger, and to ideally seek reward or some sort of pleasure, in that order. And it can be physical threats. We're trying to protect our bodies. We need shelter, temperature regulation, food, water, to not get assaulted and the like. But it can also be social threats, and we're highly sensitive to these. So how we are treated in a group where we stand. And there's a way of putting a lens or a language on what it is that people need from each other. It's called the SCARF model. Thank you. If you want to learn more about this is a relatively new foundation session on the SCARF model right after this. But this is a lens for predicting, regulating, and explaining behavior. It's very useful. At a glance, our 5 social needs at the core are status, a feeling that we are seen, valued, recognized. Certainty. We need basic information to be in the loop, to be able to predict outcomes. Autonomy, some sense of control, options, choice. Relatedness, a feeling that we belong, that we're in an in-group, we're invited. And lastly, fairness, perception of an equitable exchange, folks playing by the same rules. So in a healthy relationship, you're ideally about there on average. You have some manageable threats, but overall you have a rewarding experience in this partnership. So back to the employee-employer relationship through this lens. Let's see how it's going. Question for you all, trivia, a guess. How many employees do you think around the world say they have a healthy relationship with work? Shout it out, put it in the chat. What do you think? This is fantastic. So this is around the world. There's a study that came out from HP, the Workplace Relationship Index. 15,624 respondents across 12 countries, from the US and Canada to South America, Europe, India, Japan, Australia. On average, I heard it, someone may have read this report, 27% was the first number I heard. That is bad. Perhaps higher than some of us expected, but likely below target. I might say. So across the globe, employees are struggling. We are not well. Raise your hand if you feel like well right now. A couple. We will rely on you throughout the rest of the summit. So we know that emotional intelligence is key. That is something that we need from leaders. And employees say that they're not seeing it enough. So having this understanding of what the core needs we have are, all of us do, can help us at least identify what some of the threats we're feeling and have a more tangible tool to do something about it. Because as it stands, engagement is suffering, productivity is suffering, retention is definitely suffering. So we need to do something about it. But let's take a closer look under the hood, see where some of the issues are with this lens in mind. So 55% of knowledge workers struggle with self-worth, mental health, and feeling like a failure. In a world that's already filled with uncertainty, 46% of Gen Z live paycheck to paycheck. 72% say the pay gap is widening. We know that we all yearn for a sense of purpose, empowerment, and genuine connection to our work. 29% of people are experiencing that consistently. 42% simply don't feel cared for by employers. And 75% of millennials say employers focus on their own good, not the greater good. So what do we have here? We've hit the threat jackpot. Cursed bingo, as I call it. Every single one, and this is a small sliver of some of the data, every single one of our core needs is being threatened right now. We know what happens when we're in a threat state. Our cognitive capacity to think, to make decisions, to exist becomes diminished. And what do? We have a couple options. Well, we can only fight if we have some energy left in us, if we have a bit of flame. If we are burnt out, which 90% of employees say they are, we have two options left. You flee, quiet quit. You freeze, quiet quit. Or you flee, quit. So if we are going to work this relationship out, something's gotta give. What's it going to be? And I'd ask, as we think back to our morphology lesson earlier in the section, who's in the position to give it? And I'm sure with great power comes great anxiety. It must be incredibly stressful to be in the spotlight, to have your decisions have so much weight, to be in the room where it happens. We also know it's incredibly stressful to be in the dark and to be on the outside of the closed door. So there is no easy answer, but there is no answer at all if we don't at least open the door and have an honest conversation about what needs to change.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Camille. I think she deserves a round of applause.
Great. Yeah. Well done.
Hard act to follow. It was really surprising and scary to see all the scarf domains showing up in the data all at once. It reminded me of the start of the pandemic, particularly June 2020. The George Floyd incident happened. A terrible time. But you think about people, but just before that, were like not even going out, not even opening their door for a package delivery, right? And then that happened, and people were literally marching in the streets, and such a change. And the reason was you went from 3 scarf domains being really raw, which was certainty, autonomy, and relatedness, and then suddenly you added status and fairness to that, particularly the fairness bump, and it was such a strong motivator. It went from a manageable threat to a really overwhelming threat. And I think for a lot of people right now, the autonomy taking sort of taking the autonomy away from them becomes an overwhelming threat. Not as big as 2020, but in a similar way, we're getting to that negative jackpot that's really scary. So interesting times. Every time I've heard a CEO saying, we're thinking about mandates, they always use air quotes. We're thinking about mandates. There's very few people, because they know that real mandates come at a real price, because people are so raw at the moment. So anyway, some perspectives. Let's hear from some others. Matt, do you want to go first? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the threat jackpot is jarring, and I think just reminds us where we are, right? I think we have a well-being crisis and a mental health crisis in society more generally. And I think this period has put a lot of issues on the table that needed to be on the table. It's just a lot to deal with all at once. And I think one of the most important parts of that, again, just back to the strange gift of this era, if we want to humanize organizations, and if we know, as Camille just walked through that survey data, how big of a problem that we have, I think a little bit of empathy goes a long way. And I think part of the something's got to give is that companies need to understand that sustainable high performance over a long period of time actually has empathy and trust and psychological safety, thank you, Amy, at its heart. And those are new moves for companies that thought running companies like a machine was a good idea. Like, there was a real period where that was normal. And luckily those days are over, because we know human beings don't really respond to that. So the good news is a lot of these things are on the table. The bad news is it's a lot on the table all at once.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, to your point, sometimes we frame this as, well, people just want complete freedom. That's their starting point. I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think, of course, that's their starting point, because they're like, oh, I finally get to talk about what I care about. And that's an inherently good thing. But the other side of it is, companies need to be really clear about what this bargain is. We can't be a muddle. Like, every company is different, every industry is different, and every role is different. And this is kind of a mass customization task. And we need to reset our expectations. I think a lot of this is expectations management. When COVID started, some companies made the choice to say, hey, we're going to have permanent work from home. And they set expectations without really thinking through what the scenarios were. And other companies said, you know what, this doesn't change anything. I know these issues are on the table, but we're just going to try to keep doing the way we always did it. And to me, neither of those strategies seemed like they were going to work. Which brings us back to your life's work and the life's work of everyone on this panel. What if we just break it down to bite size and we say, if we're really interested in being great for a long period of time, which should be the goal of any organization, let's have a little bit of humility, let's have a little bit of empathy, and let's apply, as Amy said earlier, the scientific method and just say, we don't actually know what people need or want, so why don't we actually just test some things in each culture, which is a unique ecosystem, and just see what works. And some things will work and some things won't work, and we'll just learn together.
Your comment about expectations is really important. As a thought experiment, imagine going back to 2019 and saying to basically the whole world, you can all work 2 days at home every week now. And people would be like, wow, that's amazing. I can work at home 2 days a week. But now you're saying you need to come to the office 3 days a week.
Exactly.
As a thought experiment, like back then, that would have been a positive, right?
Right.
So the way expectations work is unexpected rewards are much stronger than expected rewards. Unexpected threats are much stronger than expected threats. So expected anything isn't that strong. It's the unexpected that's really strong. And particularly taking away autonomy, which is that feeling of control or having choices. Taking that away it can be very, very painful. But there are ways to do it across lots of domains, not just the work from home situation. But there are ways to do it, I think, that are much more human and humane than others. We'll dig into that. But the expectations piece is really important. And I think autonomy was one of the silver linings of the pandemic period of increased autonomy over where you work, when you work, but also your diet and exercise and parenting and health, everything. You had control over everything much more. Difficult thing just to say, sorry, that's all gone now. And we'll dig into that some more in a bit. But Amy, we'll hear from you lots in a minute. David, your thoughts on what Camille shared?
I want to build on both Camille's presentation and Matt's comment about mass customization, because I think we have for 50 or 70 years built organizations to be more efficient and more predictable. That has been the goal. And it's not like that worked out well for the average employee, right? But it was the agreed model. And I think that in this world you're talking about where everything is under threat, one of the pieces is it's not about getting back to a new roadmap that gives us maximum efficiency and maximum predictability. I think our metaphor has to change in some ways. And one of the conversations we've been having is, for years there's been a notion as boards are thinking about CEOs is, tell us how you think we get from LA to New York, right? Here's the atlas, lots of roads, pick the road, tell us how it's going to go. The conversation right now is pretend you've been pushed out of a helicopter from 1,000 feet into fog with a compass, right? What direction are you heading? And how are you going to calibrate along the way whether or not you're getting there? That's the model. And I think we can actually create some level of certainty and comfort within our organizations for we're built for this. Yes, it's uncertain, but we're built for this. But that's not the leadership framework that most people who are sitting in the C-suite and boardroom today grew up with. And so there's a learning curve that is not going to be, here's the playbook, everybody do the playbook, and we'll have a new benchmark of leadership. It's going to be customized by organizational context,
Much more adaptive. I think of a forest rather than a company, much more adaptive, responding rapidly, which the human brain does really effectively. We respond and evolve and adapt constantly in the brain.
And when David said that, I was hoping I had a parachute when I was pushed out of that.
Yes, there was a parachute in there, yeah.
It wasn't just
But I do think, look, the good news, and I think the NeuroLeadership Institute has been such a pioneer in this for so long, we have an incredible toolbox.
Yeah.
Incredible toolbox. And the science has taught us so much about how diverse teams outperform, about how well-being and nutrition and sleep actually fuels performance. It doesn't detract from it. So there were so many bad habits we had before, and I think David's point about the mental model is really important. The mental model before was totally overrated. It wasn't actually working that well. Right. And so all these tools allow us to unlock human performance in totally new ways. So from my perspective, the change management opportunity, as depressing as the current state is massive. It's right there. Because people are basically saying, okay, now we're sure this isn't working. We all kind of knew it wasn't working before. Now it's definitely not working. So what do you replace it with? As a community here in this conference, we have the toolbox.
Such an opportunity.
We have the toolbox. You hit it, David, which is, what is the leadership mental model? And how do you get people comfortable with the scientific method saying, I can be really confident about my process? And I think what's getting lost, again, is companies need to be clearer about what their purpose and strategy is. And individuals need to be clear about what's my goal? What am I actually after professionally? Not just that I like freedom, but what are you after professionally? And then we're trying to, back to the marriage metaphor, we're just trying to say, is that a fit? Let's be more authentic about what we need instead of the muddle.
Yeah, that's great. Amy, a couple of comments before we go to audience digestion again. Anything you want to add?
But that just makes me think very much of this shift from, the shift has to be from me, what do I need, to we, what do we need?
Yes,
and it's
exactly.
it's empowering, exciting, meaningful, even joyful to be a part of a we. I think all of us want to be a part of something larger than ourselves. And it's also but our spontaneous stance is me, right? And then we also need to make that shift from now to later. To be willing to take accountability for the decisions we make right now, how they might in fact come back to haunt us later.
I almost think, sorry, just to build on your point, I almost think there was such a pent-up desire that companies never asked the question about me.
And that's all
companies didn't show that belonging, caring, that we wanted to see who people were.
Not all of them.
Some companies were really good at that,
Yep.
but so many just never asked the question. So there's such a pent-up desire. that if the company asks the question, then we've got an opportunity to shift back to we, which is where we all want to be.
Yeah.
It reminds me of just this statement, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And we're seeing an increasing number of organizations call us and say, we want to completely reinvent what leadership means. And build something for the next 50 years, and we're really privileged to be in some of those conversations with some of you here. It's a fascinating step, and I think it's a really important step if you're trying to reinvent the whole organization. Like, let's rethink what leadership means and rebuild that from the ground up. Let's give you a couple of minutes to talk amongst yourselves. Then we're going to hear from Amy to a little bit more solutioning. Let's give you about 3 or 4 minutes to talk amongst yourselves, and we'll come back. Go for it. I go to conferences every week, and my first job is always to turn the lights up in the room, because they always turn the lights down, thinking that everything happens on the stage, but the learning happens in your brain, right? And you get so much from just talking to other people. It's a thing called spreading activation, a network that's subtle, spreads and gets deeper and makes connections, and you see implications just because you're giving this network some attention. It's fantastic. So hope you enjoyed that. One of my favorite collaborators in the world, and one of the most impactful researchers out there, Amy Edmondson. We're delighted to have Amy join us. And for those of you who don't know, we've in the last year formalized a partnership with Amy to help scale her work, her fantastic work on psych safety, and you can talk to folks out there about it. But phenomenal. And the cliff note is we actually pressure tested her model to see if we could improve on it, and we couldn't, which is really rare. That sounds like but it was really rare that we find something we can't improve on. You'd really built a framework that truly works with the brain. But thanks so much for being here, and I'll hand over to you.
That's very kind. Thank you, David. That's very, very kind, really. And I have to say, few things in my professional life have been as rewarding as working with David's team, and I really mean David's team, Camille. Right. I mean, amazing, smart people who have helped me take this work to a far more actionable level. So thank you for that opportunity. So here's a sort of headline to think about. I think this, as you can tell already, I'm not in favor of coming out on the side of irreconcilable differences, we're done for, right? I'm very much about problem solving and muddling our way through into an uncertain future together. And so I really do think, and we've already been saying quite a bit about it, that this is about a process of a mutual learning process of experimentation. And the experiments will be, I hope, small, and full of insight, and they will help us grow things that work and abandon things that don't work. Our real job here is to learn from successes and what I call intelligent failures. So I have a brand new book out. It was released not quite a month ago, called Right Kind of Wrong: The Science of Failing Well, which may sound like an oxymoron, but I'm going to argue it isn't. And right kind of wrong refers to intelligent failure. So I identify 3 kinds of failure. 2 of them are bad. Let's work hard to prevent them. 1 of them is good. That's an intelligent failure. I essentially define it as a novel foray, an undesired result of a novel foray into new territory. And what I really mean by that is an intelligent failure is something in pursuit of a goal, like making work, for example, in new territory. You truly cannot just look up on the internet the recipe and use it. Hypothesis-driven, meaning you have good reason to believe this might work. And finally, the experiment, as it were, should be just big enough to learn from and no bigger. In other words, we're managing risk. We're not being foolhardy with our time and our resources. That's an intelligent failure. You had good reason to believe it would work, but alas, it didn't. I believe the future of work and the softening of these irreconcilable differences will require us to engage in intelligent failures along the way. So a quick story. A couple of years ago, I was meeting with some senior executives at a financial services firm, and they knew my work, and they said, psychological safety, failure, all that failure stuff. They said, that is fine in good times, but not now. They said now, in a world thrown into tumult by COVID, it is important that everything go well. I sure empathized, right? But there's a couple of very real problems here. Number one, in a tumultuous time, failure is more likely than ever, right? Things will go wrong. Number two, in a tumultuous time, innovation is more important than ever. And that requires experiments and failures and so forth. So what these, I believe, very well-meaning executives were at risk of accomplishing was not the creation of perfection or perfect execution, but rather the guarantee that they would not hear about things that were actually happening. And you can, of course, immediately see the link to psychological safety here. Finally, we need to shift from a sort of sense of one-sidedness, or even us versus them, to using transparency and using thoughtfulness to build what I'll call mutual accountability. And I'll talk more about that. So it's not so many people over the years have misunderstood psychological safety to mean creating a kind of cocoon of perfection for everybody. Everybody gets their needs and feels really good about everything. And accountability goes out the window. That is not what I'm talking about. I have defined psychological safety as a belief that you can be candid, right? As a belief that you can take interpersonal risks of speaking up without fear of punishment, humiliation, embarrassment. I also want to be clear about this. That's not the norm in most workplaces. It is creatable. It exists in pockets everywhere, but it's not the norm. So I believe in order to thread this needle going forward, to engage in these experiments, to come out in a better place, to use the gift of the disruption, as Matt put it, wisely, I think we need both. And that's on you, right? That's on all of you. That is about building both psychological safety and mutual accountability. If you don't do either well, then that is a state of apathy. That's the quiet or not so quiet quitting. And sure, if all you took away was psychological safety, this is it, this is mission critical, perhaps you'd be at risk for creating the comfort zone. I don't see that many places doing that, so I'll move on to the one that actually does keep me up at night, the anxiety zone. This is where people feel tremendously committed to the work. They're well trained, they're good at or want to be very good at what they do, and they feel at risk. They feel they cannot offer a dissenting opinion. They feel they can't ask for help when they're in over their head. That is truly, it's more about the interpersonal anxiety zone, and it is not a good place to be in knowledge work. And it does not breed excellence. For that, we need both, right? We need to have high mutual accountability, high psychological safety, and that puts us in a place of learning and discovery. And I would add teaming, right? It really puts us in a place where we can be open with each other, kind of excited about our interdependence rather than reluctant to admit our interdependence. So I'll clarify this so nobody can leave this room or leave your desks today with the wrong idea. Psychological safety isn't warm and fuzzy. It isn't easy. It's about challenge. It's about challenging the status quo. It's not everybody being in happy agreement. It's the freedom to disagree and do so productively, thoughtfully, constructively. It's not, and I repeat, not a lack of accountability. It's, in fact, permission to hold each other accountable. You said you'd get that from me. What happened? With curiosity and compassion, of course. I asked that question. It's not playing it safe. It's experimenting to improve, knowing that there will be right kind of wrong. There will be intelligent failures along the way. By the way, they're much more likely to be intelligent if you have pressure tested your hypotheses with your colleagues. You know, this is what I think is going to work. What am I missing? You can prevent many preventable failures that way. It's not making everyone comfortable. It's about improving effectiveness in a truly challenging world. So how do you get it? Well, this is what I've had the privilege of working on for years, but especially in over the last year with David and his team, is to take a model I developed and called the Leader's Toolkit in the Fearless Organization, and really break it down and make it actionable. And it's essentially 3 buckets of leadership activities. That's leadership with a small L, meaning even as an individual contributor, you can do these things, and they help build an environment of candor and challenge and care and learning and discovery. So setting the stage is really about the discipline, I believe, to start with the nature of the work we do or the nature of the situation that we're up against. I mean, think about it. It's the old, the 20th century model of leadership doesn't work anymore, not because time just moved on and so we need to change things, but because the work really is different. Right? The work is not mechanistic. The work is not modular and broken down into utterly knowledgeable, objectively accessible bits, right? The work is co-creative and challenging and uncertain. So setting the stage by referring to the nature of the work, whether that's its inherent uncertainty, its inherent interdependence, its novelty, saying things like, we've never done anything like this before. We're going to need everybody's thoughts, early and often. Right? This is to me the logical case for why voice is needed and why, therefore, the cost of silence ought to be seen by everyone as greater than the cost of voice, which is the flip side of what's natural and normal. Inviting participation is going even a step further, right? If setting the stage is creating the rationale for why everyone's brain is needed in the game, inviting participation is literally inviting it. It's asking those good questions that say, I want what loudly, but I'm worried. Beautiful, I'm back. I worry. Okay, perfect, of course. I worry about those online. So it's asking good questions. It's saying, using people's name and saying, Camille, what are your thoughts about this project, right? Now, at this moment, she almost doesn't know what to do, because it feels so awkward when someone asks you a question to sit there quietly, right? So you suddenly flip the inherent calculus of speaking up from, well, this could be costly, but I sort of care, so I'll do it anyway, to, gosh, it would be pretty darn costly to remain silent. But in this instance, you're off the hook, right? So that's inviting participation. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, monitor your response. As a peer, as a manager, as a subordinate, monitor your response. Make it learning-oriented. Resist the quick response of, wait a minute, I don't like that idea, and take a deep breath, say, thanks for that clear line of sight, or how can I help, or let's dig into this further, right? Make it a learning experience, because that's really what it's all about. So the bottom line here, and I really do think so, is that we need to team up, right? We need to team up in psychologically safe environments to experiment thoughtfully, to recreate work, to recalibrate, right, what it means to be excellent, connected, and creative in a fast-changing world. And I'm going to hand it over to David. But only after I tell you about how to, sorry. That would be I have another category that's a basic failure, which is driven by human error. And I'm not a fan of basic failures. So let me just quickly say something about amplifying it. I think the main way to amplify mutual accountability is to explicitly, deliberately, out loud, call attention to these kinds of behaviors as normal and natural around here. Is it okay to proactively and aloud review our progress and performance as a team, right? Is it okay to hold my colleagues, my peers, to high standards? You said you'd get that to me, right? Is it allowed around here? Is that a norm for what we do around here? I think the answer needs to be yes. And not because we sort of are accusing people of not doing their part, but rather because we know we all have a lot on our minds and things slip. I can't tell you how many things in the last month alone I have promised and then forgotten because I don't have a good system. I need team members to hold me accountable. Fortunately, they do. Is it okay to express concerns about quality or timeliness? Yes, it is, because we're in an uncertain world where we need to learn together. We're not in Henry Ford's plant anymore. And this is equally shared. It's not just a boss job or a team leader job. So that's where we need to go. And now I hand it over to David to handle this fundamental tension.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
think it deserves also a round of applause. I love the phrase mutual accountability, that people have the ability to, call out their leader as well, both ways. The concept of asking for feedback came up earlier, and I think it's such a powerful tool for leaders to ask their teams for feedback, and it creates feedback both ways. Let's do some questions. We've got a couple that have come in online, and folks in the room that have a question, we'll have some mic runners around. They're walking around now, so we can get those ready. If you have a question, put your hand up and we'll get some mic runners to you. But we'll take a couple online because it's good to be inclusive and put people who are not in the room first, right? Mitigate distance bias. So, and this is for the whole group. Maybe the second one is for you, Amy. But
Yep.
for the first one, how does a C-suite leader balance empathy and expectations when they have a board of directors or shareholders continuously putting pressure on them to really only focus on business results and bottom line? How do we balance empathy and expectations when that's that constant pressure? Who wants to take a stab at that?
The answer is yes.
Yeah, right.
No, so look, if you're a board of directors or shareholders, what are you looking for? You're looking for great performance over a long period of time. If you say to them, hey, interested in empathy? They're like, I'm interested in great performance over a long period of time. As the leader, your task is to deliver that thing to all of your stakeholders. We all know you can't do that without empathy.
Right.
We are lucky that people like David and Amy and Camille and David are all on the forefront of better explaining this to boards and CEOs. But we got a lot of work to do in the educational process so people can understand empathy's on the table, not just to be a nice person, which is a good reason. Empathy's on the table because it fuels high performance over a long period of time. You should talk about it explicitly more and more, but let's get the framing right. The framing is, companies exist to be great, and humans strive to be great, and you need empathy to do.
Need both. The answer is yes.
I'd like to add one sentence.
Yeah.
I want everyone to sort of write this one down. Don't let a problem above you become a problem below you. Right? It just, I can't tell you how many times I am asked, but they, I'm like, okay, your job is to look down and across, right? And you do the very best you can to create a pocket of excellence, learning and discovery where you are.
Where you can,
I love that. I want to write that down if I can. I guess I have a pen.
You may,
It's the learned helplessness. And I'm basically a professional coach inside of a company, and I get that all the time. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting.
Don't let a problem
Why
above
can't you just do what you need to do? Because if you do that, the results go up, and who's going to argue with you? No.
Right. Just do your job, right?
Correct.
David,
And by the way, it involves empathy.
Yeah, absolutely, because how do you know how to get the best out of your team without understanding what makes them tick?
David, thoughts on that question?
I love both those points, right? And so I'm not going to repeat them. I'm going to build on it, which is two things. There's a book, if you haven't read, I would encourage you to at least read, called The End of the World is Just the Beginning, which explores to what extent actually global business models from the last 70 years are broken and not coming back. In boardrooms, that light bulb is going off more and more, and I actually think this question, in a way, is less about the real board conversations that are happening and more about the noisiness of the stakeholder environment, right? If you decide if you use the word sustainable in your investor meeting, you're going to have somebody come up and say, that is some woke BS. What are you talking about?
Over time.
Right? Over time.
Right. And so, the notion is we have to actually shift our language because companies are trying to grapple with this stuff. Not every company, but most companies recognize that things have changed. And part of it is helping create a new vocabulary for having the real conversation because the macro environment is noisy and messy.
Yep.
And I would just, I guess, reframe. It doesn't have to be empathy. You don't have to feel what someone else is feeling. And yes, that word is stigmatized to be, something else. Sustainable, I didn't know that one had a bad rap. But if that's also the case, it doesn't have to be about let's sit in a circle and talk about how we're feeling and give each other hugs.
Right.
It's if you want your soil to produce your crops, you have to water it. You can't just keep extracting until it goes dry. That is depletive, that is exploitative. That's just the basics. How is the soil doing? Does it need water? Does it need sunlight? give it that.
Yeah, we talked about that the last summit. You've got exploitative, depletive, sustainable, regenerative. And regenerative is you're leaving the system better every year. It's a really important way of thinking about this. We've got a few questions. We'll take one more online, and then we'll go to folks in the room as well. We won't forget you. Maybe one for Amy in particular, but everyone can answer. In cultures that are more collective, where saving face is important, how can we enable people to become more comfortable with the idea of failure? And how do we help leaders become more brave to embrace the idea that failure is going to help people get smarter? Amy, any thoughts there?
Well, you can couch it, if you will, if you wish, under the umbrella of innovation. But I think it's really just about being clear the difference between the right kind of failure and the not right kind. And again, I don't stigmatize mistakes. I make many of them all the time. But this is about the willingness to experiment. No organization will be successful over the long term if it's not willing to take risks, right? And all risks have in them the potential to end in failure, right? That's just a given. So we need to educate people. Please read Right Kind of Wrong, because it's really about, and I think it is giving you helpful language to have this conversation productively. It's not about accepting mediocrity. It's not about being okay if people operate outside legal or ethical or behavioral boundaries that you have set. It's about their willingness to try new things that just might work, right? And if you're not able to create conditions where that's possible, then you will not be able to thrive over the long term.
That's great. David?
Just a quick anecdote from the CEO of Infosys. So Infosys is India-based, global company, engineering organization, high predictability and low tolerance for failure. And when the CEO came in, he thought, we have to get better at this. And part of it was just nomenclature. He started talking about their strategic initiatives for each year. These are the bets we're going to make. And they talk about bets now with the notion that bets have some probability of failure.
But let's have high quality bets.
Let's have high quality bets, but let's understand that some bets aren't going to work, and we will learn quickly from that, and we will move on and adapt.
Yeah, one of the companies that's the most successful in the world these days, Amazon, has actually had the most expensive failures of any company. They've really tanked billions of dollars a number of times on things, and they've learned and picked up, and gone on. Let's go to some questions in the room. Where do we have the mics? We've got one over here. We've got any questions in the room? We don't have any placed at the moment. Otherwise, we can go online. I feel like an auctioneer suddenly. We've got one over there.
There we go.
Thanks very much.
How would you all define transparency?
How would you define transparency? What a great question. Matt, your organization invests in 80-something companies, at Apollo, and so it's probably something that you think about. How would you define transparency?
Well, I think you could go pretty deep into that topic. I mean, my starting frame on it would be more about clarity of what's your strategy, what is the company trying to do. On things like ESG, we've published an ESG report for the last 10 years of just saying, here's what we're seeing in the portfolio of companies that we work with at Apollo. And I think, basic transparency is just trying to understand the different factors that are driving a business. And the other side of that is the individual side of transparency Camille's point about empathy is well taken. Like this is about just clarifying what someone needs, clarifying what a company is trying to do, and on the most basic level, just saying, can we deal with the muddle by just being clearer about that, the two sides of the value prop.
That's great. Camille, your name came up. What are your thoughts on transparency?
I'm just trying to get the etymology in my head. I think of the opposite, opaque. You cannot see through something. You don't know what's on the other side. So it can take many forms, but it's generally being able to see what's actually going on.
Yeah, I think there's a movement toward radical transparency, and we wrote about that a few years ago. There are some organizations that are completely open. You can listen to every meeting and look at everyone's expense report, do all that. Companies that start like that, I think, have been quite successful. It's a difficult thing to move to, but I think there's a push towards transparency, globally. There's a push towards that, and also the internet makes it very hard not to be transparent. Everything, is kind of out in the open there. Fantastic. Any other questions in the room? We've got one over here. Yeah.
Hey, David.
Hey, Dean. Great to see you.
My question, one of the questions that we have on our Pearl survey, and we ask it frequently because it matters, and which is I feel safe to take risk at work. And we're finding that there's a connection potentially between psychological safety and my ability to do that. And that follows a lot of things. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about psychological safety. What can leaders do to create more psychological safety around elements around feeling safe because of my race, my identity, or the organization, or even the level that I'm in. But I'm curious, like, what can leadership do to create psychological safety across an entire company?
Well, so much to say about this, so let me try to be brief. First of all, I think it's really helpful to get metrics, to actually identify whether or not there are significant differences, and then to make those metrics transparent, to be clear about this as what I'll call a joint problem-solving opportunity. This is not something that is sort of solved on high for others, but this is something that once we name it, we now have an opportunity and an obligation to figure out how to change it together. So that is a big area of opportunity, I would argue.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. I mean, it really helped me to understand, and through talking with Amy, that it's actually quite a high-level skill.
Right.
So it's not an easy thing. Like, as we look at our solutions, like generally learning to be more inclusive is relatively straightforward, right? But actually, like learning to set the stage, invite participation, respond thoughtfully, it's actually quite difficult and quite rare. And I thought we were pretty good at it. I thought I was pretty good at it. And the more I looked at it, the more I saw how much work, we had to do and I had to do. And there's an intentionality that's required that's much greater than I realized. So I think it's almost like going to the gym. There's a certain level of fitness you've got to get to and keep, where particularly that mutual accountability thing. So I think it's a high order skill that needs constant focus and really quite a lot of attention.
It's a super important point, right? It's interpersonal skill, and it's more rare than common.
It's difficult. I mean, challenge productively, right, is one of the habits inside the third domain there, right? So respond thoughtfully. Challenge productively. It's such a difficult thing. I mean, we could all do with like days of practice of just that particular habit, right? It's quite a hard thing to really build. Last comment there.
Yeah, I think we've over the last few years with the pandemic and with the surges of just different ways of working and the cognitive load on everybody, emotional load on everybody, we probably over-vectored as an HR profession on the emotional safety part, psychological safety. And so you've got a little bit of intolerance built up at top organizations that, okay, but we need to be commercial now. Your point is this is commercial.
This is how to be commercial.
And so I think, putting that back to your gym metaphor, right? We need to be overt. Don't assume that people are making the connection between psychological safety and productivity.
Yeah, people arguing better is commercial.
Right.
Exactly right.
Because they're not arguing enough, or they're arguing badly.
Yeah.
Or pointing out a mistake, right? That is commercial. A mistake caught early is so much easier to handle and smaller than one that spirals out of control.
Fantastic. Look, a couple of closing comments. I see we're coming to the end. Firstly, it's something that you need to practice. If you haven't seen our team solution that we built with Amy, talk to folks out there in the food area. You'll see, you can have a look at it and see what's there. The other thing is you'll see a completely new solution. We're often asked, like, how do you put all this together? Like, we've got all these different pieces. How do you put it together? For the first time, we've actually built an off-the-shelf leadership development solution, which we called very simply LEAD, because we like simple words. And LEAD builds psychological safety all the way through, but actually teaches you about yourself, others, and teams, and kind of weaves everything together with the psychological safety lens, with the SCARF lens, with mitigating bias lens, kind of through the whole thing. So this is the first time we're showing that. You go and have a look out there, and you'll see a completely new social platform.
And if you're online, you can just...
If you're online, someone will put a link in the chat, so you can look at team as well. Just some closing comments for a minute. So we think about irreconcilable differences. Part of this for me is that we need to think about certainty and autonomy differently. If you get rid of all certainty, you have no mutual accountability. If you anchor too hard on certainty, you have mandates, right? If you give people too much autonomy, you have just no performance sometimes. So it's in any domain, we think it's about good certainty with good autonomy, and find creative ways to have both. Like when it comes to the work, the mandate about, bringing people back to the office, there's a way to do this that feels fair, that feels certain, but still gives people high autonomy. We wrote about this in a piece called The Patchwork Principle. It just came out in Fast Company recently. You can read that. Just look up The Patchwork Principle. My team can put that in the chat as well. But really high certainty, really high autonomy, balancing both of those with the work from home situation, with all the changes that we want to make. We think that the recipe for reconciling some of those differences is focus on both. Not massive autonomy, not massive certainty, find the balance between them. So just in closing, thank you so much to our panelists. I appreciate your big ideas and thoughts, and hopefully you've had a great kickoff. Thank you.